April 7, 1943. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. A fuel hose snapped off a Grumman F4F Wildcat with a metallic click just as Second Lieutenant James Elms Swett was settling into his cockpit. His tanks were only partly filled. He had never flown a combat mission. And in less than 15 minutes, he was about to become a legend. Swett didn't grow up in a military dynasty. He grew up around pumps. Born June 15, 1920, in Seattle, and raised in San Mateo, California, James was the eldest son of George and Nellie Swett. George was an electrical engineer, a Marine reservist, and founder of a small company that built marine pumps and turbines, the kind of quiet, industrial machinery that kept ports and ships running. James grew up surrounded by gears, valves, horsepower charts, and blueprints. He was a working-class kid, more comfortable with tools and torque wrenches than with speeches or spotlights. In high school, nothing about him screamed future war hero. After graduating in 1939, he enrolled at the local junior college. That's where everything changed. The federal government, anticipating war, launched the civilian pilot training program. It paid for college students to learn to fly, building a reserve of potential military pilots. James jumped at the chance. Flying came naturally. The same mechanical intuition that helped him understand pump systems made aircraft controls feel like an extension of his hands. He soloed quickly, piled up flight hours, and by the time he finished the program he had logged about 450 hours, more than many military instructors. That experience would later give him a crucial edge in combat. As war loomed, James enlisted in the U.S. Naval Reserve on August 26, 1941. A month later he began flight training. At Naval Air Station Corpus Christi in Texas, flight school quickly confirmed what the civilian program had only suggested. Swett had real talent. He handled an aircraft with a natural feel, backed by discipline and a calm presence under pressure. He graduated in the top 10% of his class in early 1942. The best students were offered a rare choice: accept a Navy commission or transfer to the Marine Corps. Swett chose the Marines. On April 1, 1942, exactly 1 year before his legendary mission, he earned his commission and his gold wings as a Marine Corps aviator. At 5'11" and 154 pounds, with brown hair and blue eyes, he still looked more like an ordinary college kid than a future ace. Advanced training followed at Quantico, then carrier qualifications aboard the USS Wolverine on Lake Michigan, and finally tactical training in San Diego. The instructors, veterans of Pearl Harbor and Wake Island, drilled harsh but simple truths into every pilot. Stay fast, never try to turn with a zero, trust your wingman, conserve your ammunition, and make every burst count. By March of 1943, Swett was on his way to war aboard the escort carrier USS Nassau. He moved through Hawaii and then into the South Pacific, joining Marine Fighting Squadron 221, VMF 221, part of Marine Air Group 21 of the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing. VMF 221 had already earned a place in Marine Corps history during the defense of Wake Island in 1941. Rebuilt with fresh pilots and Wildcats, the squadron now headed for Henderson Field on Guadalcanal to continue the air war. Henderson Field was little more than a rough strip carved from jungle and coral. The runway was pierced steel planking laid over muddy ground. Revetments were sandbags and palm logs. Maintenance buildings were tents. Rain turned everything into a swamp. Heat, humidity, and malaria were constant threats. But this crude airfield was one of the most important pieces of real estate in the entire Pacific War. From Henderson, Allied aircraft controlled the sea lanes around Guadalcanal, threatening any Japanese attempt to reinforce their troops. Control of Henderson meant control of the Solomons, and that meant keeping open the lifeline to Australia. Swett spent his first weeks flying patrols, learning procedures, and getting used to the routine of combat operations without actually seeing combat. His division never caught the enemy in those early flights. He flew, he waited, and he listened to veterans talk about the day when the Japanese would come in force. That day arrived in April. Allied reconnaissance soon revealed a frightening picture. Large formations of Japanese aircraft were massing at Rabaul, Bougainville, and several other bases. Radio traffic surged, and intelligence officers understood that something major was coming. What they were seeing were the opening moves of Operation Igo. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plan to crush Allied air power in the Solomons with a massive coordinated strike. For April 7, 1943. Yamamoto assembled a force of 177 aircraft bound for Guadalcanal, 67 Aichi Val dive bombers, and 110 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters. They would launch from bases more than 400 miles away, climb, form up, and sweep toward American ships and airfields in precisely timed waves. Coast watchers, Australian and New Zealand volunteers hidden deep behind enemy lines, spotted the Japanese formations and sent urgent warnings. By early afternoon on April 7th, their reports reached Guadalcanal. At Henderson Field, the radio suddenly blasted a message no pilot ever wanted to hear. Condition red, condition very red. More than 150 enemy aircraft were inbound. Every fighter that could get off the ground was ordered into the sky. 76 Allied aircraft in all. Wildcats, Corsairs, P-38s, P-40s, P-39s, everyone. At that moment, James Swett and his 4-plane division were just finishing a routine patrol over the Russell Islands. They had been in the air for nearly 2 hours and were running low on fuel, so they turned back to Henderson. They landed around 2 p.m. and taxied in. Ground crews rushed to the Wildcats and began hand-pumping fuel, about 117 gallons per plane. It was slow, exhausting work, and fully fueling the fighters would take at least 30 minutes. They didn't have 30 minutes. Swett climbed down from his cockpit and stretched his legs, expecting a short break. Then the order came from operations: launch everything, partial fuel or not, they had to go now. Better to meet the enemy in the air, half-fueled, than die in their cockpit with a full tank. The fuel hose was ripped from Swett's wing tank, spilling gasoline onto the steel planking. Someone yelled for him to get back in. Around him, every fighter that could move was racing toward the runway. His aircraft was the F-4 Wildcat, America's first-generation carrier fighter. By early 1943, it was already considered obsolete, next to the new F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair, but in the right hands, it could still kill. The F-4 carried 650 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing, with 240 rounds per gun. That meant about 18 to 20 seconds of total firing time. It was slower and clumsier than the Zero in almost every category: speed, climb, turn radius. But it was tough and hit hard. Swett firewalled the throttle. The Pratt & Whitney R-1830 twin Wasp roared to full power. Loaded with fuel and ammo, the Wildcat lumbered down the short strip, needing every foot to stagger into the air. At about 70 miles per hour, he eased back on the stick. The Wildcat grudgingly lifted off. Then came another Wildcat ritual, cranking up the landing gear by hand. Swett had to take his right hand off the throttle and spin a crank around 30 times while flying with his left hand, during the most vulnerable seconds after takeoff. Once the gear was finally up, he joined his 3 wingmen and began to climb. It felt agonizingly slow. Japanese dive bombers would be approaching at 15 to 20,000 feet, at roughly 1,800 feet per minute in combat conditions. Getting up there took long, painful minutes, while 177 enemy aircraft were closing at 300 miles per hour. Below him, he could see American ships around Tulagi, cruisers, destroyers, cargo ships, tankers. Thousands of sailors, most of them unaware that a massive raid was bearing down on them. On the radio, fighter directors, coast watchers, and pilots all talked at once. It was 1943, no digital radar screens, no modern battle management, just eyeballs and voice radio trying to keep chaos under control. At about 14,000 feet over the Russell Islands, Swett saw them, tiny black dots on the horizon, quickly growing into dozens of aircraft in tight formation. More planes than he had ever seen at once, more than he had even imagined seeing. He keyed his radio: tally-ho, bandits, 12 o'clock high, multiple bogeys. The answer came back: all fighters engage, good hunting, no long briefing, no elaborate chessboard tactics, just engage. 76 Allied fighters versus 177 Japanese aircraft. Swett rolled into a diving turn, leading his division toward the dive bombers. Below, he saw VALs in neat formations, each a slow, vulnerable bomber carrying a 1,000-pound bomb and a 2-man crew. They were deadly if they reached the fleet, but fragile if caught first. He picked out 3 VALs that had drifted slightly from the main pack and maneuvered above and behind them, perfect position for a classic high-side diving attack. At around 350 miles per hour, he rolled in on the trailing VAL. The target ballooned in his gun sight, 200 yards, 150, 100. He squeezed the trigger. All 650 calibers thundered to life, the Wildcat shaking from recoil. Tracer lines reached out and stitched into the valve's fuselage and wing. The rear gunner's fire stopped. Smoke, then flame, then a mid-air explosion. First kill. No time to celebrate. He slid the Wildcat onto the tail of the second valve as it dove toward the ocean, trying to escape. He fired short, aimed bursts. The bomber caught fire and plunged into the sea. Second kill. Less than 30 seconds had passed. He pulled up and hunted the third valve. The pilot, now fully aware he was being hunted, tried to run, but the valve was slow, barely 200 miles per hour in level flight. Swett closed in and fired again. Another explosion. Another bomber gone. Third kill. 3 dive bombers destroyed in about 90 seconds on his first combat mission. The cost of those seconds was separation. His wingmen had peeled off onto their own targets. Swett found himself alone in the middle of the largest air battle the Pacific had seen so far. And the danger wasn't just enemy fighters. As Swett climbed back toward the main fight, American anti-aircraft guns opened up from the ships below. To the gunners on deck, anything high in the sky was just a silhouette, friend or foe. It all looked like a dark shape with wings. Shell bursts filled the air. One explosion went off dangerously close to his left wing, and shrapnel tore through the Wildcat's skin, damaging an aileron. The aircraft suddenly felt heavier, less responsive, and holding level flight took real muscle. Most rookies would have turned for home. Swett checked his gauges, oil pressure steady, temperature normal, engine strong. The controls were battered but still workable. He stayed in the fight. Ahead, he spotted 6 more Val dive bombers heading straight toward Tulagi Harbor in a tight line-ahead formation. They were separated from their fighter escort and flying almost unprotected toward the ships. Swett dove. Coming in from above and behind with the sun at his back, he closed in on the last bomber in the formation. At less than 100 yards, he fired. The Val exploded so violently it looked as if the bomb had detonated in mid-air. Swett flew straight through the debris, his windscreen briefly blinded by smoke and fragments. He rolled onto the next bomber and fired again. Another kill. Then another. And another. Working down the line, he delivered short, precise bursts, making every round count. The fourth Val absorbed more hits. His ammunition was running low. Swett closed to point-blank range, close enough to see the rear gunner firing at him, close enough to see the Japanese pilot's face, before finishing the attack. When he finally pulled away, 4 more bombers were falling into the sea. 3 kills from his first attack, 4 more from his second. 7 enemy aircraft destroyed in roughly 15 minutes. On his first combat mission, Swett had become an ace in a day. But one Val was still racing toward the fleet. Ahead, at wavetop height, a lone Val was streaking toward the ships. Swett dove after it. He nudged the trigger. Nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. He was completely out of ammunition. All 1,440 rounds had been fired. The correct play here was obvious. Break off, head home, rearm, live to fight again. Swett didn't do that. Instead, he pressed the attack, unarmed, trying to bluff or scare the Japanese pilot into breaking off his run. He dove straight in at the bomber. The rear gunner wasn't impressed. He opened fire with everything he had. Bullets smashed into Swett's Wildcat. The windscreen shattered. Glass fragments ripped into his face, cutting his cheek and forehead. Blood ran into his eyes. The engine took hits. The oil cooler was damaged. Oil pressure dropped. Temperature spiked. The engine began to die. With his view obscured by oil and blood and his engine coughing itself to death, Swett finally broke off and turned toward Henderson Field, about 15 miles away. The Wildcat bucked and shook. Black smoke poured from the cowling. He wasn't going to make it back. Below him were Florida Island and the waters of Tulagi Harbor. If the engine quit, he'd have to ditch and hope someone saw him before the Japanese did. A few moments later, the engine made the choice for him. With a metallic shriek, the Pratt & Whitney seized. The propeller froze solid. The Wildcat turned into a 7-ton glider. He had maybe 2 minutes of airtime left. Swett trimmed for best glide, around 110 miles per hour, and searched for a calm patch of water. He found a spot near Florida Island. If he could land it right, he might survive. If he misjudged the angle or speed, the Wildcat would cartwheel or nose straight under. He manually lowered the landing gear to act as a water brake. He slid the canopy back, so it wouldn't jam on impact. He cinched his shoulder harness until it hurt. At about 50 feet above the water, he eased the nose up slightly, aiming for a shallow, 5-degree nose-up attitude. 40 feet, 30, 20, 10. The tail touched first, just like the book said it should. The Wildcat slammed into the water and decelerated brutally. Swett was thrown forward, slamming his face into the instrument panel and breaking his nose. Pain exploded through his head. The aircraft immediately started to sink. The heavy engine pulled the nose down. Water rushed into the cockpit. Swett fumbled for the seatbelt buckle with blood-slick fingers. It finally released. He tried to climb out, only to feel his parachute harness snag on something inside the cockpit. He was stuck. Water climbed from his waist to his chest to his chin, cold salt water mixed with blood, stinging his cuts. Then it reached his mouth, his nose. He went under, still tangled inside the sinking Wildcat. Had survived one of the fiercest air battles of the war, only to drown 10 feet below the surface. His lungs burned. His vision began to narrow. With one last burst of strength, he yanked on the harness. It tore free. He pushed off the cockpit and fought blindly upward, not even sure which way up was. His life vest, which should have inflated automatically, hadn't. Maybe it was damaged, maybe it had snagged. Either way, he was almost out of air and still underwater. Then, suddenly, the CO2 cartridge finally fired. The vest exploded with buoyancy, yanking him toward the surface. He burst into the air, coughing, choking, gasping for breath. Blood and seawater streamed down his face. His nose throbbed, his face burned, his chest ached from the harness impact, but he was alive. The air war was still raging overhead, fighters diving, guns chattering, bombs exploding, ships firing skyward. Within about 15 minutes, a U.S. Coast Guard rescue boat spotted him bobbing in the water. The crew dragged him aboard, gave him morphine for the pain, and, according to later accounts, handed him a bottle of scotch. He took a grateful pull as the shock and adrenaline started to fade. They brought him into Tulagi Harbor, and then to the Naval Hospital on Guadalcanal. Doctors cleaned and stitched his facial wounds, set his broken nose, and checked for internal injuries. Somehow, there weren't any major ones. He was battered, sliced up, and sore, but essentially in one piece. In the days that followed, intelligence officers and fellow pilots pieced together what he had done. Other aviators had seen his initial attack and his dive on the trailing valves. Shipboard gunners had watched the string of bombers going down. Witness reports matched up. The final tally: 7 enemy aircraft destroyed, all dive bombers. On his very first combat mission, he was now an ace many times over, and one of the few ace-in-a-day pilots in U.S. history. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding carrier and aviation forces in the South Pacific, personally nominated Swett for the Medal of Honor. Mitcher's recommendations weren't taken lightly. Once he recovered, Swett went right back into combat with VMF-221. The squadron transitioned from Wildcats to the faster, more powerful F-4U Corsair. In June 1943, now a first lieutenant, Swett flew cover over the landings at Rendover Island. He shot down 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers and shared credit for a 0. 11 days later, near New Georgia, he downed 2 more Bettys while protecting his wingman, then shot down a 0 that was about to kill that same wingman. But another 0 slipped behind him and raked his Corsair with cannon fire, wrecking the engine and fuel system. For the second time in 3 months, Swett had to ditch a crippled fighter over water. This time he came down far from friendly lines, alone in enemy-controlled seas. He got out of the Corsair, climbed into his raft, and waited. Hours later, 2 Solomon Islander scouts in a canoe spotted him. These were local islanders working with Australian coast watchers. They dragged the wounded American into their canoe, took him to their village, then paddled him by larger canoe to a hidden coast watcher station. The coast watcher radioed for help. A PBY Catalina flying boat landed in a sheltered bay the next day and hauled Swett aboard. He was exhausted but alive. For saving his life, the islanders were paid the equivalent of about $14 in cloth and canned beef. Swett always believed that reward didn't come close to what they deserved. By late 1943, he was still flying and still scoring kills. Over Bougainville, he shot down additional 0s and vowels and scored several probables. By December, he had flown 103 combat missions and had 15 confirmed victories at age 23. On October 10, 1943, while he was still in the war zone, Major General Ralph J. Mitchell presented him the Medal of Honor at Espiritu Santo. The citation described how he led his division into a vastly superior enemy force, shot down 3 aircraft in his first dive, then 4 more despite intense fire that shattered his windscreen and wounded him before he ditched his fighter. In December 1943, the Marine Corps finally pulled Swett out of combat. He arrived in San Francisco on New Year's Eve and was assigned to Marine Corps Air Station Santa Barbara as an instructor, teaching new pilots the skills that had kept him alive. In the spring of 1944, he went to the White House. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, a former Assistant Secretary of the Navy, asked detailed questions about the Corsair and air combat. The meeting ran about 20 minutes, far longer than planned, because Roosevelt kept asking follow-ups. Swett remembered him as genuinely engaged and curious. Later, he moved to MCAS El Toro, where VMF 221 was retraining in newer Corsairs for Operation Olympic, the planned invasion of Japan's home islands in late 1945. Everyone knew it would be unimaginably bloody. Then Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed by atomic bombs. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. Operation Olympic was cancelled. VMF 221 ended the war with 185 aerial victories, second among all Marine squadrons. After the war, Swett took command of VMF 141 at NAS Alameda, flying Corsairs again. But when the Korean War broke out in 1950, the Navy decided Medal of Honor recipients were too valuable to risk in combat. Swett argued that he should lead his squadron in war. The Navy said no. Frustrated, he left active duty but stayed in the Marine Corps Reserve, eventually retiring in 1970 as a colonel, with 29 years of total service. After leaving active flying, Swett went back where Head started, his father's pump and turbine business in the San Francisco Bay Area. George Swett died in 1960, and James took over. For the next 2 decades he ran the company, small, technically demanding, steady rather than flashy. It provided jobs, made reliable equipment, and kept ships and harbors running. The calluses that had faded from years in the cockpit came back from years on the shop floor. He eventually passed the business to his own son. The firm stayed modest but successful, one of thousands of quiet American companies that powered the post-war boom. In retirement, Swett moved to Trinity Center, and later Redding, California. He became a frequent school speaker, talking not about how many airplanes he shot down, but about values. He talked about the values that had shaped his life: doing your job well, supporting the people beside you, taking care of your equipment, and owning your responsibilities. When students pressed him about combat, he didn't glorify killing. He talked about training, teamwork, and preparation. In 2006, the History Channel's series Dogfights recreated his April 7th mission with computer graphics. Swett himself narrated parts of the episode, calmly walking viewers through one of the wildest 15-minute combat sequences of the war. For younger audiences, the contrast was striking. A soft-spoken elderly man describing a day where he single-handedly wrecked a Japanese bomber formation and survived an impossible ditching. On January 18, 2009, Colonel James Elm Swett died in a Redding hospital from heart failure after a long illness. He was 88. He was buried with full military honors at Northern California Veterans Cemetery in Igo, California. Marines fired a 21-gun salute. Fighter aircraft flew a missing man formation overhead. The flag that had draped his coffin was folded with perfect precision and handed to his family. His headstone is simple: name, rank, dates, Medal of Honor. No list of kills. No mention of Ace or 7 planes in 15 minutes. Just a quiet marker among many, surrounded by other veterans, some who died in combat, others who died in old age, all equal in the end. James Swett's life captures something essential about the generation that fought World War II. He wasn't born into privilege, and he wasn't raised for command. He was a working-class kid who understood machines, seized an opportunity through a government training program, and brought natural talent into a system built to turn ordinary civilians into combat pilots. That system gave him what he needed: thorough training, a dependable, if imperfect, aircraft, skilled ground crews, solid logistics, and commanders willing to trust a 22-year-old with life-or-death responsibility. But none of that alone could make him dive on 6 bombers, press an attack with no ammunition, ditch a crippled fighter flawlessly, or choose after the war to build machines quietly instead of chasing the spotlight. That part was character. And Swett's story was not an exception. It was one of thousands. Farmers became tank commanders, Shopkeepers flew B-17s. Factory workers drove submarines. The United States didn't win the war with a handful of superhuman individuals. It won by giving everyday people the tools, training, and trust they needed, and relying on their courage when the moment arrived. On April 7, 1943, James Elm Swett climbed into a half-fueled Wildcat and launched into a sky filled with 177 enemy aircraft. 15 minutes later, 7 of those planes were falling into the sea. A massive Japanese strike was coming apart, and a 22-year-old pumpmaker's son had rewritten the record books before returning to what he had always been, a quiet professional, doing his job as well as any human being could.